When I told people with knowledge of these two devices that I wanted to make a comparison video, they said that you can't compare and you shouldn't, it's apples and oranges. Then when I asked my friends, they said, you want to compare between a what and a what? Now, joking aside, I think you can compare because there's a difference between what the software can do and what the controllers can do. So let's go ahead and compare this box of blinking lights to this one. So first, let's talk about the fundamental difference between these two machines. The Ableton Push 2 is a controller designed for one purpose only, which is to work with Ableton's live software. It's a DAW, a digital audio workstation, complete, comprehensive, amazing piece of software for creating and arranging your music. You can use the Push 2 with other DAWs as a standalone MIDI controller, but it doesn't make sense. There are much cheaper and better options. It doesn't mean, though, that you should pick it over the Mark III. The MASCHINE MK3 and all the other Machinas, again, are a MIDI controller. They're a controller. They have no ability to make sound on their own. And it's designed for one purpose as well, to work with the MASCHINE software by Native Instruments. It too you can use as a MIDI controller to control other DAWs or other devices, but that's not what it's made for. It's designed for a single purpose, to use the MASCHINE software. The MASCHINE software isn't as comprehensive as Ableton Live. It's not a full-fledged DAW. It's designed for creating beats quickly and organizing them one after another, performing them live and creating variations based upon them. And you can import your MASCHINE projects or use it as a VST within another DAW, whether it's Ableton Live or any other DAW, and complete your project from there if you want to add things that MASCHINE doesn't support. So why do I think that they're comparable? Because if you look at what they're designed to do, to help you get inspired to create a beat, to put it together quickly, to perform it live, they're actually pretty similar. When you get to the features that differentiate Ableton as a DAW from MASCHINE, there's actually very little that you can do with the Push 2. You're pretty much back in the software without using a controller. Okay, first let's talk about the hardware overall. The Push 2 is slightly bigger and heavier than the Mark III. Both of them feel really well built. Both have great color displays. The Mark III color displays are a lot brighter, but when you use the Push 2 standalone, it doesn't seem like it's not bright. It's just when you compare the two, the Mark III seems brighter. Both have great pads. Obviously, the advantage of the Push 2 is that it has 64 pads, but they're a bit smaller than the 16 pads on the Mark III, so it depends what's important for you and how you want to create beats. A big difference on the hardware side is that the MASCHINE Mark III also has a built-in audio interface. Balanced line inputs, microphone input, gain control, volume control, line outs, headphone out with volume control, MIDI in and out. Very comprehensive input and output support. The Push 2, on the other hand, besides power and USB, just has pedal support. You're going to want to have an audio interface at the very least to reduce latency when you're playing with the pads. I like the Audiofuse because it has plenty of inputs and outputs, a MIDI interface, and a USB hub, but you can go for something cheaper if you don't need those things. Okay, let's talk about beat making workflow. I've got 3 tracks on each device. One is a piano in this case, one is an 808 kit, and the third is a sample. To show you how these things handle samples and how you can chop them up. Let's start with playing kits. On the MK3, you've got 16 pads to play with, and on the Push, you've got a 16 pad mode, but you can also expand it to a full 64 pads at once. Let's go to our melody track on both devices. So here, obviously, 64 pads is a much bigger and better canvas for playing melodies and chords. If you're coming in from a piano, these chord shapes might take a little getting used to, but it's much easier to play chords on the Push 2 than on the MASCHINE Mark III, where the pads are fewer and farther apart, which makes it harder to play chords. You can, of course, add a MIDI keyboard to either of the two and play that way. Let's talk about scales. Both devices support a broad range of scale selections, including chromatic scales, which make much more sense when you have this many pads. On the Mark III, you're better off just selecting a scale with less notes. That way you can play across an extended range. In terms of soft keys, the Mark III has 8. The Push has the advantage with 16 soft keys, 8 on top, 8 on the bottom. Both have 8 macro knobs that are sensitive to touch, capacitive sensitive, so the minute you touch them, the user interface is able to act upon that. The Mark III has a built-in arpeggiator, which is really easy to use. It's just a simple touch of a button or a shift button to activate. I can get the same effect on the Push, but in order to do that, I need to preload a MIDI effect onto my device track. Once I do that, all the parameters are configurable through the interface, but it does require that extra step. Of course, the arpeggiator parameters are also configurable on the Machina as well. In terms of chord shapes, the Machina has another nice trick up its sleeve. On the Push 2, you've got to learn the chord shapes, which, like I said before, takes some getting used to, though it has its flexibility advantages. If you press the chord key on the Machina, you've got a very extensive, though non-configurable, database of chords available at your touch. That's a song right there. Now, just like I added an arpeggiator effect on the Push 2, you can also add a chord MIDI effect to the Push 2, but it's not as powerful or creative, I'd say, as this one. I've seen a Max for Live plugin that you can download with chords, but it's not as easy and accessible as the Mark III. Okay, let's talk about making beats. The Push 2's 64 pads give you an amazing canvas for sequencing. The top 4 rows are steps in your sequence. The bottom right quadrant is the length of your sequence. Choose your drums on the bottom left quadrant and sequence away. The workflow here is really nice. Every time you touch a pad in the bottom left quadrant, it changes the lights shown on the top 4 rows to represent the sequencing for that particular drum. If you want this same sequencing experience in the Machina world, you need to buy the Machina Jam, which has a very similar sequencing layout, but that's obviously more money and more desk space. So the Push 2 certainly wins out here on sequencing. Let's choose this hat. Both controllers have a dedicated repeat button, which is a fun feature. Repeat speed is adjustable. The pads are velocity and pressure sensitive, so I can perform live or hit record and sequence, including with pressure sensitivity. So that's beat sequencing on the Push 2. We'll talk about sequencing melodies soon. Now let's take a look at step sequencing on the Mark III. So here, because you have only 16 pads, you only see 16 steps, not 32. And you need to hit a button to select different drums. So it's an extra step. You can either have the pads set to fixed velocity or have the velocity with which you hit a pad affect how it's sequenced. The way the pattern is displayed on the screen gives the Mark III an edge compared to the Push 2. Let's take our hat. Here we have a repeat function, also pressure sensitive and good for live performance and recording. Super easy, and the screens are a great visual aid. Okay, so that's sequencing beats. Let's talk about sequencing melodies and instruments overall. Selecting instruments on the MK3 side is really nice. There are these little icons which give you an idea of instruments or instrument categories. You can filter using tag clouds or menus which types of instruments you want to select. Up until the recent version of the Machina software, including the pre-release one that I'm using, there weren't full previews for instruments, kits, and so on. But I understand that as of the official launch, the Mark III will have live previews as well as you scroll, so you don't need to load the instruments, and that's a huge benefit. The Push has had this for quite some time. So as you scroll through the different options, sounds, or kits, you get audible previews of what they are, and that's a huge plus. The Push 2 doesn't have tag clouds, so if you have a lot of subcategories, you're going to need to do a lot of scrolling to find the sound you want. So the Mark III has an advantage there. These kit previews are a really nice way to get an idea of what you're getting into before you load it up. Okay, let's talk about sample slicing. Both controllers have great sample slicing features. There's no clear winner here. Let me try and show you the differences. The Mark III screens are a little bit bigger and brighter, so you see the sample information a little bit better. And they're split up into two. And this split is actually pretty smart because it lets you see the entire sample on the left side, and you can always zoom in on the right side to the parts that interest you the most. Now you can zoom in on the sample with the Push 2 as well, but this split into the entire sample and the parts of it is pretty nice. Both controllers support sample splits, including automatic transient detection on device, including the fact that you can set the sensitivity, and that's a great starting point for then going ahead and chopping your samples further. So that's a quick workflow overview on the Mark III. On the Push 2, also a very straightforward and simple workflow. You turn on slicing, you have auto detection, and you can take it from there. The fact that the Push 2 has 64 pads is an obvious advantage here because you can have more than 16 samples available at your disposal without paging. Nudging start and stop points is super easy. And you can see that as I change the threshold for detecting slices, you could easily cover the entire board here with up to 64 slices. If time stretching features are important to you, so changing pitch without changing tempo and vice versa, the Push 2, or actually Ableton's live software, is much more powerful in that regards. It has more algorithms and works better. There is time stretching and pitch shifting on the Machine software as well, but it's not as powerful as the Push 2. Okay, let's talk about sequencing melodies. There's a big difference between the two systems here. Let's dig in. So I've got my piano instrument on both devices. Now you can obviously play live and record live with both of them or use an external keyboard, but when it comes to sequencing melodies, there's a big difference. So step mode on the MK3 doesn't initially let you enter pitches, just the placement for notes. Let me just mute my drums here. So while the MK3 has the advantage of a piano roll on screen, editing notes is sort of a pain where you've got to go through a menu and change pitches manually. I don't know. You tell me if this is right for you. Great. For me, sometimes it's just faster to get on a mouse and keyboard and just do these on the computer. But then again, sometimes it's fun to just change stuff around like this. With the Push 2, getting notes on a grid is a much faster process. The Push 2's grid becomes a piano roll style sequencer. Every column is a step, every row is a note on the scale. You just tap to insert a note. The top row represents half bars. It's very easy to add or remove notes. You can add chords. Let me clean this up a bit. Let's add another 8 steps. You can zoom in on any 8-step part and then play it all together again. So it's a pretty flexible way to just jump around your sequence, add and remove notes. So this way of step sequencing melodies is much better than the Mark III, but the Mark III has the advantage of the screen that lets you zoom out and see a bunch of octaves together at the same time. So there are pros and cons here. So let me show you what that would look like on the Mark III without a mouse and keyboard and computer screen. I've got my Machine in chord mode. And now let's go into my step sequencer, see what we've got. So it's actually possible to edit multi-note sequences like this as well, just like we did before. I can pick my note and move it around. If I like, I can also move groups of notes around by selecting them with the events feature and moving them around. You can also extend the selection beyond a chord. You can really put a window around any group of notes that you want and move them around, transpose them, nudge them around, and so on. You can also make all these changes while the beat is playing. Okay, let's talk about projects. On the MASCHINE MK3, you can easily load and save projects from the interface. You can see the names of the projects, quickly select what you want, choose if you want to save the previous project or not, and then fire away. And with Push, you can't save or load files within the device itself. You've got to use the computer. And this is what the screen looks like when you do. I don't think this is such an super important feature when you compare the two, because if you want to name projects, you've got to use a keyboard anyway with both machines. But it's an issue you might want to consider. Okay, let's zoom out and talk a little bit about mixers. Both machines give you really nice mixing capabilities. In case you have more than 8 channels, you can easily scroll left and right, find the channel you want to adjust, and do it that way. So that's on the Push 2. On the MASCHINE, there's also really nice mixing capabilities. Beside the fact that you can mix on a per track or per group level, as they're called in MASCHINE. The interesting thing about the way the MASCHINE builds its drum racks or its drum kits is that it gives you easy access to mix on a per item in the drum kit as well. So here I drilled down into the kit itself, and this knob represents the volume just of my kick, and I can go ahead and easily change the volume of each and every one of the elements in the kit on the same screen. You can do this in the Push 2 as well, but to my knowledge, you can't mix the individual levels of a particular kit on one screen. Moving on, let's talk about the touch strip. The Push 2 has one big touch strip, which can be used mainly for pitch bending. You can use it for some octave changes in a few of the sequencing modes, but that's basically it. You can also, through the software, program it to control other things, though to my knowledge it always bounces to the middle, so unlike a mod strip where it can start from the bottom and stay in the same place, the minute you leave your finger off the strip, it'll bounce back to the middle. If you know how to avoid this, please leave a comment. I'd love to put it in the description as a tip for others. The touch strip on the MASCHINE is much smaller. That could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what you prefer. And it can do one of 4 things. The first is pitch bend, like in the Push 2. It also has a mod or modulation wheel mode. And the advantage here is that it doesn't bounce back to the center. It has a nice strum or notes mode, as they call it, which will either cycle through all the pads on your MASCHINE, or if you hit a few pads, then it will only cycle through the pads that you're holding. This also works for pads and kits, not just for notes, so you can get pretty creative with this. The final of the 4 modes for the MASCHINE MK3 Smart Strip is Performance Mode, and that lets you apply different effects, insert effects, on a per group level, on a per track level. And you can select one of a few from the menu. So this is another one of those nice things that the Mark III has that you can probably get to with the Push, but it requires knowing the software or downloading Max plugins or extra configurations. It's just nice to have this stuff right out of the box. I mean, if we were to look at the software and list features, the features of Ableton Live versus the features of the MASCHINE software, Ableton Live would probably win out very easily. But if we look at the controllers and what you can do with the controllers, it's a much more interesting contest. Let me show you a couple more things. So I'm adding a few effects here, and each effect has its own control parameters. The MASCHINE MK3 has a really cool feature where you can just tap the knob that represents a parameter that you want to add into your macros page. Let me choose, for example, this and this. And now these two parameters appear on my macros parameters page, which is accessible with one quick click of the macros button. I can go ahead and collect a few more parameters. Let me take these. And with a simple touch, they've been added to my macros page. The next feature, I don't even think you can do with the Push 2 in the software, and that is parameter locks and the transition between them. So let me show you how that works. This is the page with all my parameters, and I'll set it at some initial position. Now the lock function takes a snapshot of everything on the device, but I'll just use these parameters for the sake of the example. So I'll hit the lock button, change some parameters, and then the minute I release the lock, everything goes back to the way that it was before I pressed the lock initially. Now you can actually store multiple lock states and transition between them. So let me show you quickly how that's done. I'll press lock again to set my first state, and then I can go ahead and choose another pad and have that be a second lock state. So let's make some changes. I'll go into my pad, and instead of changing parameters, I'll just delete or mute entire pieces of the rack of the kit. And I will update this as the lock state of this particular pad. So let's start with the drums on by hitting this pad. Let's wait for them to come in. And hit Shift Lock to enter my lock changing mode, and hit pad 2 to turn off those drums that I'd previously muted. Pad 1 will turn them back on. Now, if I don't want the transitions to be immediate, I can turn on morphing and decide how many bars or parts of a bar I want the transition to occur across. So that is parameter locks or snapshots in the MASCHINE MK3, an amazingly powerful feature. You can understand why this decision is so hard. I'm not aware of a way to do this in Push 2 or Ableton Live. If you are, again, please leave a comment. I'll be happy to link to it and add it to the description. Okay, one place where there's a clear winner between the two is with parameter mapping of third-party plugins. Let me explain. So let's bring in a third-party VST. This is the Arturia Mini V, the Minimoog emulator. Okay, great. We brought this in. We can play around with the knobs on the screen, but we want to see those parameters on Push. And when we bring it in, what we see on Push is this. So what you need to go and do is map the parameters of the synth manually. And that's a pretty tedious process of going into the plugin, clicking configure, and then if it's too big, you've got to resize it so that you can see both the plugin and the DAW, and then start clicking the knobs so that you map the parameters you want, so that sort of you expose the parameters you want to Ableton, and once you do that, they will appear on Push as well. Now, in the MASCHINE software, however, everything just works. You go select your third-party plugin. I'll take the Mini V. All the presets just appear the minute you open it, and then when you double-click a preset or drag it into your group, all the parameters just magically appear nicely categorized. Now, I love Ableton, and I'm sure the dev guys at Ableton have some good reason for this. Maybe they think people would prefer to manually configure stuff. I don't. If there's a way to get this done automatically, I'd appreciate it. Perhaps other people would. If anyone watching this knows a way to do it, leave it in the comments. I'll add it in the description. Okay, let's see how these units perform on USB power only. I'll unplug the Mark III. You can see that it is less brighter, but it's actually not that bad. The Push 2, however, when you unplug it, it still works, but it becomes very, very dim, almost almost unusably so. So this may impact the portability of your unit based on your needs, whether you need to be portable or not, but it certainly is fun not to have to carry a power supply if you don't have to. Okay, let's talk about arrangement. I'll start with the push. I'll go into session view, and here, each and every one of the pads represents one clip or one sequenced pattern or one recorded pattern in my song. The rows will typically represent a different section in the song, and just like before, every column is a different track. I can use the arrows on the right to activate entire rows at once. Now, this is a super powerful way to build your thoughts and to make the building blocks of your song, but actually there's no song mode in Ableton Push, in the controller itself. You can't create one song that will just play throughout. You can jump manually between the rows like you saw me do before, but you can't arrange a song out of scenes in the sense of, okay, play scene 1 once, scene 2 twice, then go back to scene 1, then go to scene 3, and so on. You've got to make these changes manually, unless you want to commit to a timeline, and even that you've got to play manually as well. Let me show you how this works within the software. So I just hit record, and I'm in my session view, so this works just like the push, but because I hit record, everything I'm playing now is committed to the timeline. Back to session view, I can change a scene. Okay, now I'm in scene 2. Back to arrangement view. You can see the song being slowly imprinted onto the timeline. Let's move on to scene 3. So to summarize, in session view, everything is organized and accessible like the push, but arrangement view, where I'm now committing my arrangement, is completely inaccessible within the push 2. The advantage, of course, of arrangement view is now this is a complete DAW. It's a completely open and free timeline. So I can do anything I want here. I can move things around. I can add a voice track. When we get to the Mark III, you'll see those are things that you can't do easily. You've got to do that with a DAW integration. So again, total and complete freedom here to create my arrangement as I want, but I'm no longer within the Push 2 environment. I'm using a full-fledged DAW with a computer, mouse, and keyboard. Okay, let's look at the Mark III way of doing things. I'm going to switch into arrangement mode. So here, the left screen shows you your entire song, as well as the window to which you're zooming into on the right screen. And you can use these knobs to zoom in and out and watch your song go by. So in the Mark III, you can arrange a song. A song is basically an arrangement of scenes, one after another. Each scene contains one pattern for each group that you have in your song, each group or each track that you have in your song. The length of each scene is determined by the length of the longest pattern. All the shorter patterns just loop around themselves until the longest pattern ends. While this is going on, you can edit the patterns in real time, change parameters, and so on. You can jump around the song any way you like using the pads. So basically very similar to the Push 2's session view. Now you can take the Maschine software and embed it as a VST within Ableton or within any other DAW, and then once you commit to that timeline, just like we did before, to the live timeline, you could add voice tracks, change around, edit stuff as much as you want, but then again, you're separated from the controller. So this, in my view, is why the controller comparison is an apples to apples comparison and not apples to oranges. The Maschine software doesn't attempt to be a DAW, and the Push 2 controller doesn't give you access to a lot of the DAW functionality in Ableton Live 9. So where does that leave us? First thing, it's not an easy decision. Hopefully the past 20 some minutes have helped you. If they did, hit like, subscribe to this channel. There's more of this stuff coming. Thanks for watching.